All right. Thank you so much. We are ready to start, belatedly, to start the next session, which I guarantee you is going to be as lively, if not livelier, than the last one. But before we start with our speakers, I'm very pleased, well, sad, but pleased to announce that we are going to first show a video by Judy Heumann, our Special Advisor for International Disability Rights. She could not be here today. I believe she's in China, where I think it's her second, if not third trip there, working with the government of China on how they can be doing a better job to protect the rights of the disabled in China.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in this annual DRL Office of Global Programming Bidders Conference. My name is Judy Heumann, and I'm the Special Advisor for International Disability Rights here at the State Department. With my staff, we work across the State Department, federal government agencies that do international work, and with a multitude of international NGOs and foreign governments to promote the inclusion and full participation of persons with disabilities. We do this in a variety of ways. We work to make disability rights an integrated part of U.S. foreign policy and strongly encourage it in our foreign assistance. We also work to increase the knowledge and capacity of colleagues to promote disability rights and the inclusion of disabled people into all aspects of their work. Disability rights are human rights, not special rights. People with disabilities have the same rights as everyone to non-discrimination, inclusion, and full participation within their societies. These are the basic principles underlying our Americans with Disabilities Act and the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, known as the CRPD or Disabilities Treaty. I hope that many of you know about this treaty. Yet the rights of disabled people are often violated due to prejudice and discrimination. Physical, attitudinal, and institutional barriers can also marginalize us. When we talk about promoting and advancing the rights of persons with disabilities, it's also important to emphasize how critical this is for women and girls. Women and girls with disabilities are far more likely to suffer from gender-based violence and sexual abuse than our non-disabled peers. Some studies indicate we are at least 30 to 40% more likely to be victims, and frankly, all women and girls who survive GBV are likely to have acquired some kind of mental or physical disability. Women and girls with disabilities are also more likely to experience additional discrimination simply by virtue of being female. This happens in the realms of education, job training and employment opportunities, leadership training, access to justice, and in many other areas of life. This is why it is important to emphasize the inclusion of women and girls with disabilities in our foreign policy and in our programming efforts. Thankfully, we see positive changes occurring due to the work of disabled people's organizations and the influence of important instruments such as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. As a signatory to this treaty, we promote the rights of persons with disabilities by encouraging effective implementation of the Disabilities Treaty by states parties. This includes linking U.S. expertise and technical assistance to interested governments. We also work with civil society in other countries, especially disabled people's organizations, to strengthen their ability to effectively promote disability rights and participate in implementation and monitoring of the Disabilities Treaty. So why is this so important for DRL programming? First, including persons with disabilities in all DRL programming wherever possible makes your proposal more responsive and more attractive to proposal review panelists. We look for effective inclusion of disability in your statements of interest or your SOIs, in your full proposals, in your program activities and objectives, and in proposed outputs and outcomes. We look for this whether the program in question is disability-focused or not. Everyone here wants to get awarded DRL funding for your proposals, or you wouldn't be here. and this is a great way of improving your chances. I strongly believe that the main reason more applicants don't include disability in their proposals is they don't know where to start. They may not know of any local disabled people's organizations and other NGOs that focus on disability rights. There are many U.S.-based groups with whom your organization could partner that would strengthen your proposals while addressing the needs of persons with disabilities. We are currently, or have recently done, disability-specific programming in Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, Vietnam, Morocco, Libya, Kenya, Tanzania, Mexico, Armenia, and other countries. We can help you locate local partners when needed. Secondly, and more importantly, disability inclusion is the right thing to do when we're working so hard to advance the human rights for all people. Among historically marginalized communities, such as the LGBT community, women and girls, youth, and religious and ethnic minorities, disabled people are part of these communities. Disabled people around the world, for a variety of reasons, are often the forgotten people. We've often not been visible because societies and communities are not inclusive. In many countries and regions, disabled people are also ostracized because communities are not inclusive. Families are embarrassed. They choose not to face the risk of discrimination, and on and on. We must not let this continue. As supporters of USG-funded human rights programs, we must proactively address the issues and human rights concerns of disabled people, and a great way to do this is through our DRL programming. Finally, I just want to say that being inclusive of disabled people in our DRL programming and programming across the State Department is also a great way to open the door to discussions and programming for other, perhaps more sensitive human rights issues that many governments don't like to discuss. In many cases, host governments are willing to work on advancing the rights of persons with disabilities, including through the Disabilities Treaty. We can use this opportunity to open the door, to continue, or in some cases start a conversation on other more sensitive human rights concerns. Thank you very much again for your interest and participation today. I look forward to seeing how we can all work together to be more inclusive. I also encourage you to speak to other NGOs who have successfully begun to include disability in their DRL-funded programs and in other projects that the State Department is funding to get knowledge and experience that will help you move forward. Thank you very much.
So I told you she's fantastic. I'm so sorry she couldn't be here in person, but we do have our team lead in the Office of Global Programming, Ramiro Martinez. Can you stand up? So Ramiro can answer your questions on programming that we do in the field of protecting the rights of the disabled. I also want to note, for those of you who've been paying attention to our solicitations in the past 4 years, that we now include language in the instructions for program submissions that we privilege proposals from organizations for your programs that you are inclusive of populations at risk. That includes persons with disabilities. It includes populations at risk such as LGBTI persons, ethnic and religious minorities, women and children. So we are, again, it's not a requirement, but those are the ones that we will look at more favorably of saying this is a good inclusive program proposal. So with that, I want to turn to our panelists, and I know we're squished for time, and I need to mix up the order a little bit because a couple of them have to leave. I know you all have to leave because I know you all are busy. So I'm going to mix up the order and have our Special Representative for International Labor Rights, Sarah Fox, start off.
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, and thanks to all of you for all of the important work that you do. As Judy said about disability rights, we support labor rights here at the Department of State because labor rights are also human rights. They are not just important in helping people to realize their potential, to join together, to act collectively on issues of importance to them in a place that all of us spend most of our lives, which is at work. But they're also very much key economic rights. And they are part of building societies that are inclusive, where prosperity is broadly shared, and which, as a result, are more stable and more secure. We here at the and I work with the Office of International Labor Affairs here at the State Department. We tend to focus particularly in both our diplomatic efforts and in our programs on freedom of association and the right to collective bargaining. Promoting these basic enabling rights in countries where space is increasingly closing for civil society, broadly speaking, or in countries where workers are harassed, threatened, or killed for their organizing work is a significant area of focus for us. We believe that independent labor organizations are important incubators of democratic practices at the grassroots level. Often they have cross-regional membership, multi-ethnic representation, very broad-based agendas, and internal democratic procedures that make them very valuable partners for us in countries in which the State Department works. They're, as I said, also enabling rights which are fundamental to achieving equitable growth, stability, and healthy industrial relations systems. And that can contribute also to a more conducive investment climate, a more attractive area for U.S. companies and other companies to invest and bring decent work opportunities to workers in those countries. Denying workers those rights can also cost those societies in terms of lost productivity, innovation, and growth, as well as undermining the rule of law and creating instability. So, within the area of freedom of association and collective bargaining, we are also focusing particularly on these days on promoting collective bargaining. Workers primarily come together to form worker organizations as a means by which they can deal collectively with their employers over their terms and conditions of work and deal with the government to express to the government what their needs as working people are. And so we need to be concerned not only about making it possible for workers to form those organizations, but helping to ensure that their employers recognize and deal with them as legitimate representatives of their workers, and that governments include them in policy consultations about matters which affect the society broadly and workers in particular. We are focusing in certain countries, particularly on sectoral, trying to increase the possibilities for sectoral bargaining. We do a lot of work in countries where there is a booming garment industry. This is a big the garment sector around the world is a big supplier of garments to the United States, and it is an example of a place where workers are often among the lowest paid. It's a very low-wage sector, and where workers struggle to get their rights at work organized. Organizing on a factory-by-factory basis is very difficult, and often it's very difficult even if they do organize, a factory owner is reluctant to change conditions, improve their wages, because it's such a competitive industry. So part of the solution there is to deal with some of these issues on a sectoral basis so that you can lift together the conditions for all the workers there. So that's a focus that you will see in our programming. We are also very much focused on the rights of migrant workers. Migrant workers are among the most vulnerable workers in the world. And we have focused in particular on that corridor from South Asia to the Gulf, which again, among migrants, are among the most vulnerable and often exploited migrant populations that we have. We do work both in countries of origin and in countries of destination. And we are increasingly, one of our focuses has been on recruitment abuse. Many of you who work in this area know that there is a huge problem for migrant workers around the world in the manner in which they are recruited for employment through practices where they're charged very high fees and often end up in situations of effectively debt bondage, which is a kind of forced labor. They're also often engaged in other victims of other fraudulent practices, being promised a particular job only to arrive in the country and to find that there is another. So we have been working again on addressing those issues as well. I need to finish. We'll have a time for more questions and answers afterwards, but I think that probably hits the two key areas.
Thank you very, very much, Sarah. I'm going to go next to, and again, this is in order of people having to leave as I understand it, to Cobb Blaha. He is the Office Director for our new Office of Security and Human Rights. He can give you far more detail than I was able to this morning about what this office does.
Good morning, everyone. As Pat said, the Office of Security and Human Rights is the newest office in the Bureau of Human Rights. And we are doing some of the most cutting-edge work in the department. The concept behind this office, and we do a lot of different things, and I'll tell you about those in just a sec, but the unifying concept behind this office is that good human rights practices improve security. So the next time you hear somebody say that we've got a balance between human rights and security, that we don't accept that. That's a false narrative. Good human rights are good security. Some of the issues that we deal with, one of the issues I think you'll all be familiar with is we are the department lead for vetting under the so-called Leahy Law. For those of you who don't know, the Leahy Law prohibits U.S. security assistance to units and individuals who have committed gross violations of human rights unless there's been accountability. We half of the office, 10 people, is in charge of Leahy policy and Leahy vetting. But we also are increasingly monitoring something we're calling civilian casualties or civilian harm mitigation, working both with other parts of our own government. Our office works a lot with DOD and the Pentagon to improve practices to minimize civilian casualties, to improve transparency in terms of reporting such incidents, and trying to get our partners to do the same thing. Our office is also responsible for the annual report on child soldiers. We also vet arms, munitions, and security technology that's being sold or given overseas. But the concept that unifies all those things is that United States assistance should promote, United States security assistance should promote good human rights practices. Where do you come in? Well, under the Leahy Law, what we rely upon is, in order to figure out whether a given unit or individual has committed a gross violation of human rights, a lot of it is open source. And I frequently speak to NGOs that come in, and my message to them is always the same. My message is the Leahy Law belongs to you, and it belongs to you because we rely on open source reporting, including from civil society organizations. So one of the things that's of most assistance to us are reports from civil society organizations, credible reports about alleged gross violations of human rights by security forces. The more detail, the better. So to the extent that that civil society is trained, to the extent their capacity is built, to the extent that they know how to do reporting that's going to be deemed credible, to the extent that they're trained to do that, that helps us. The other thing beyond that would be even more helpful is if, and this is the next level of sophistication, if we could find more civil society partners who, in addition to reporting on individual evidence and individual events in a credible way, can do some more meta-analysis of what's going on, mapping areas where alleged gross violations of human rights are taking place, mapping which units are stationed in which areas, mapping trends over time. These are the kinds of things that will be very, very useful to us, because when we are talking to our interagency partners about whether a unit is eligible or not, they always look at whether the information is credible and the indicia of credibility, and also trends. But we think, and you'll agree, that far better than mapping human rights violations after they occur and denying assistance to units is prevention. And so the other thing that we are very interested in is figuring out what's going, if there are things in countries that are going right, what's going right. And again, civil society can be really important. One of the things, the United States government and the United States military and different parts of the State Department train security forces, they train police, they train militaries on human rights. But one of the things that would be really helpful would be for each country to have trained civil society that knows how to interact with the military, that knows the military, and that can make feasible, concrete recommendations to militaries for practices that will reduce gross violations of human rights, that will reduce civilian casualties, and more and more civil society organizations that can responsibly interact with militaries to promote investigation, prosecution, and conviction of security force members who committed gross violations of human rights. And why is that important? Well, it's important because it's justice, but it's also important from our point of view because once that happens under the Leahy Law, that unit can again receive assistance. And that's really the goal. I mean, if we don't want 20,000 U.S. troops to be invading countries every 5 years, we need responsible partners who have rights-respecting, accountable security forces, and this is the path. The same thing on child soldiers. We rely heavily, when we're figuring out whether to list a country or not, on civil society reports. And so to the extent that civil society is made familiar with the Child Soldiers Protective Act and is able to responsibly and credibly and in detail report upon those things, that's something that would be a very major help to us. So I see I just got a pink sign that says time, so I'll call it here. But this is an area where the involvement of civil society can really, really be key. And to the extent that you all could find civil society partners to train, it would be all to the good, and it would make a measurable impact. Thanks.
Thank you, Cobb. And I will say, I can't overemphasize, we can't overemphasize the need for good, credible reporting with granularity on security sector abuses units, for example, names. That's very helpful. And some of the more powerful programs I've also seen is when we brought civil society activists, human rights activists together with military in the same room. So let me keep moving on here. David, do you mind if I let you go last? Okay. So then I will talk to our newest special envoy. It's our special envoy for the human rights of the LGBTI persons. Randy's first-year anniversary was 2 days ago, is that right? It was, yeah. So it's been a thrill to have been working with him for the past year. Randy Berry.
Thank you, Pat, and good morning to you all. It's a real privilege to have a few minutes to talk a little bit about what the Department of State, what the U.S. government is doing in terms of the promotion of the human rights of LGBTI persons globally. As Pat mentioned, this is really one of the newer policy areas of focus for the United States government. Though I've just been on seat for the last year, we actually began our policy advocacy work and program work in 2011. It was that year that two important things occurred. One was the issuance of a presidential memorandum that outlined 5 core policy areas in which we as part of the U.S. government would be focusing on this particular issue. And then that same year, Secretary of State at the time, Hillary Clinton, delivered a speech at the Human Rights Council in Geneva, which basically paraphrased of something you heard from Judy Heumann was that Judy said that disability rights are human rights. This is the phrase that the Secretary used in also drawing an emphasis on global women's issues and women's rights. She applied it also to the case involving LGBTI persons as stating that it is as simple as the fact that it's a core human rights issue. I wanted to talk just a little bit about, in addition to those 5 core policy areas, some additional areas of focus that we will be working on over the coming months, the remainder of the time of this administration, to talk a little bit about the principle of integration, which you also heard Judy talk about, which is a very important, I would say, critical part of our work. And then lastly, to talk a little bit about our funding and program side, which is principally through the Global Equality Fund. First of all, in terms of policy areas of focus that we're going to be really honing in on for the remainder of the year, I just want to throw out 4 that I think are especially relevant to this particular crowd. One of them is to continue our work to seek decriminalization of same-sex activity around the world. That, as many of you might know, that one of the principal challenges that we face is that in more than 75 jurisdictions around the world, there is some form of criminalization to be a member of our community. And obviously, we're deeply concerned with those countries that levy penalties on those laws, including the death penalty in a small number of those. The vast majority of those nearly 80 countries that criminalize, in fact, don't do anything to enforce those laws. That doesn't make them any less onerous. That really we're working with countries that don't and have never really enforced their anti-LGBTI laws to get them off the books, because we believe it gives a sanction for vigilantism. It gives a nod to those who would continue to discriminate, and we think there's no place for those kinds of laws in our world today. So that's going to continue to be a focus. We have seen some success, not enough. Mozambique was the most recent jurisdiction to criminalize last year. The government of the Seychelles has announced an intent to do the same. We want to see more and more countries following that footprint. A second policy area we're going to be focusing on is how to focus on issues related to bias-motivated crime and reduce violence against members of our community. Just last June, the White House convened a special summit during Pride Month last year to talk about issues related to bias-motivated crime, and we're currently working on enhancing and developing new strategies to make sure that we're matching our program work to this policy interest. But that's going to remain a significant issue. Building broad coalitions and finding allies is also very, very important to this. And this, I would say, in terms of equality of access to a number of other essential services, which goes to the heart of what it means to be an equal member of society. That includes equal access to health care, equal access to education, equal access in employment and housing. So these are our core issues. And lastly, among these 4, a special focus on the issue of issues facing the transgender community. It's clear that even when we break down the LGBTI community, that the rates of violence and discrimination are much higher in almost any society against members of the transgender community. So we're bringing a greater focus over the coming months on that particular issue. Just a word that on any of those issues, we as Judy, as Sarah, as all of us do here in DRL and at the State Department, really emphasize the principle of integration. That that none of the communities which we serve, which we seek to improve conditions for, live in a vacuum. They live in dynamic societies where equality of opportunity is connected to all sorts of other issues related to economic and political rights. So we really do look for proposals. We look for engagements that really take that message to heart. In summary, I wanted to talk very briefly about the Global Equality Fund, which is our programmatic entity. This was established also in 2011, and over the life of this fund, it has delivered around $24 million of assistance to civil society organizations in more than 50 countries around the world. We do that through 3 primary streams. One is through larger scale technical assistance engagements, often with regional organizations or organizations organizations that have the ability to help others. Another stream implemented under this Global Equality Fund is a small grants program that is basically run out of our embassies and consulates overseas that nominate activities into this. These are generally one-off programs and with a very, very small seed funding. And lastly is in terms of emergency funding. And I have to say this part of the program is sadly used much more often than I would like to see. This is where we engage with a consortium called Dignity for All, which provides emergency assistance to human rights advocates, to LGBTI advocates, and urgent advocacy efforts when we see them emerge. And again, we sadly see this tapped far too often. This is a shared platform. I would really emphasize this, that this is the U.S. government's effort and investment in making sure that we are working with our partners and allies. So this fund is not a United States government fund. This is a fund that brings together more than 20 national government, business, and foundational partners. We have 12 national governments that now partner with us. We have recently added 3. The most recent to come on board were Uruguay and Argentina, and we're working with several others to see them exceed to the fund as well. So we really think that through building these broad coalitions, we're going to be most effective. Thank you.
Thank you, Randy. And so last but certainly not least, here is a great pleasure for me to introduce our Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. And I will say, David probably maybe slightly tougher job than Randy, but might be a toss-up of taking on some of the most sensitive issues of meeting with governments, fearlessly taking on governments, of saying you have to protect the rights of people to believe what they want to believe or not believe, and being able to do this in a way that is compelling. And it's just a sheer joy to watch David at work. David Saperstein.
No, thank you, Pat. Thank you for all your extraordinary leadership in our efforts here. You really have done a remarkable job with a remarkable staff. So I'm going for time just to touch on a couple of key points here. First, the good news for us is that Congress, bipartisan support, has significantly increased the amount of money that we have towards this, at least tripling, if not more, the amount of money that we'll have this coming year for religious freedom work compared to the past years. And we already had a fairly robust program going. It's an issue Congress believes in very deeply and has been very generous in its support for for our efforts. I think you know that our programming deals throughout DRL and in the religious freedom thing. There are ways to get emergency short-term funds to people when they are threatened or under attack, or organizations for legal fees, dependent support, security-related concerns that they might have, as well as some short-term capacity building at times of crisis for organizations that many of us are involved with. The bulk of our funding is the long-term funding that you are all familiar with. For us in the religious freedom realm, these areas are focusing this year on mitigating societal or sectarian violence, minimizing legal or other restrictions to the right freedom of religion. I'll come back to that. Training civil society and government officials on the legal and policy protections for religious freedom. Strengthening the capacity of civil society and religious leaders to track religious freedom violations and conduct advocacy to stop them, and combat religious extremism in key countries. Now, all of these foci that we've had this year will continue next year and probably the year after that. I think if we're going to expand in these areas or others, it will be in first, building resilient communities resistant to radicalization. Secondly, combating extremist education, particularly so much of what happens in the school has such an influence. We're particularly interested in the NEA region, but there are efforts in Pakistan and other countries like that we are supporting across the globe as well. Training parliamentarians and government officials to better implement positive developments in religious freedom policy. Pushing back more assertively on structural threats to religious freedom, burdensome registration and governmental approval regimes, threats to religious freedom and freedom of expression posed by blasphemy and apostasy laws. Strengthening our efforts in lifting up the links of religious freedom. I talked about all the work we're doing in terms of extremism, but we want to connect it with the broader agenda of the department and out in the field, have it better integrated with CVE, CT, conflict resolution efforts that are robust efforts here, but the religious freedom parts of that need to be lifted up. And finally, I would just add, we do a good job in tracking rates of attitudes or actions dealing with categories of hate crimes in terms of anti-Semitism and some other hate crimes, but there are other areas, Randy, I would include the LGBT community, and for us, Islamophobia, where we want to expand what we're doing in these areas and get better data available, because when countries have data in front of them, it's much easier for us to engage with them about being effective. So these are some of the areas that we're going to be moving in. Just to give you a few examples of this, in Iraq and Syria, a lot of our programs are dealing with mitigating societal and sectarian violence and strengthening the resiliencies of those religious minority communities that are being targeted by extremists, and strengthening the capacity of civil society and religious leaders to track religious freedom violations and conduct advocacy to stop them. In Syria, in addition, we're focused, and this will be true in Iraq as well, on transitional justice issues, internet and media freedom as well here. In Vietnam, in Laos, DRL grantees are working to minimize legal and other restrictions of the right to the freedom of religion. Vietnam is particularly interesting to us because it is writing an omnibus law, and what it does as a country that's been fairly authoritarian in the way that it has tried to control religion, what it does in this law is going to be a vital interest. And every draft of the law, and I just got the latest draft literally 2 hours ago in translation to go through, but I was just there 2 weeks ago. Every draft has become better and better about protecting more and more pieces of religious freedom. We'd like it to go one step further in addressing some of those structural issues that I talked about. And there's openness, there's dialogue going on, and the civil society groups are crucially important, have been crucially important, and will be crucially important in how the law develops and how it is implemented. And we face similar situations in a number of the other Southeast Asian countries in general that we are working very hard on. These are the kinds of issues that we're dealing. In addition to that, we forged partnerships, DRL has forged partnerships with DOJ and DHS to assist governments worldwide in training local officials on legal and policy protections for religious freedom, how to combat hate speech without resorting to blasphemy laws or other legal and penal responses to it. We've done these trainings in Indonesia, Bosnia, Greece, Spain. Here we have some on the board or coming close to having on the board in terms of Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Macedonia. We think South Central Asia is an area of great opportunity for us to make some improvements, and there's work we're doing in Sudan on many of these same issues. The Sudanese government really has been reaching out to us to try and find a way to address some of the structural concerns there as well. So I lift up all of these as examples of what we're doing, and I thank you very much for your participation. And Pat, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. Thank you all to our panelists also for staying on time. I'm hoping we have some time for discussion. Good. That's why we're trying to keep everybody on time. But I will again note that, as you can see, we're tackling some of the most sensitive issues, and we've got people out there fighting for everybody's right to, whether it be to organize labor, to the right to love who they want to practice their religion freely. And part of it is combating these kinds of hate crimes and trying to change attitudes, build allies, or to have accountability for abuses committed by security forces. Some of the hardest work that we do, and these are the people daily who are slogging it through to try and make change happen. So, because we kept everybody on time, I think we do have some time for question and answers, about 10 minutes. So again, I would ask, because this is being recorded, please go up to the mics in the back, please, and identify who you are, if you feel comfortable. If not, you don't have to. I wanted to note before, we don't have wireless mics here because we can't do anything wireless in the State Department for security reasons. That's why you got to go up to the old-fashioned mics.
Great, thanks so much. Ashton Geezy, I work at Outright Action International. And of particular relevance to me, because I used to work here in the building as a representative from the Defense Department, I'm really interested to see if there are any efforts yet basically trying to get LGBT issues into that sort of human rights training that's happening for defense officials around the world.
Ashton, thanks for that question. We're just at the beginning edge of that. This has been a pretty active year as we've weighed in, but we have recently established a good connection with our Department of Defense, and we're going to be starting that initiative. So I'm hopeful that we'll see some progress on that. Yep.
More questions? Sorry.
Hi, I'm Eric Sommerfeld at the University of Maryland. I'm interested in a question across all of these areas. What role does Internet security and Internet freedom play in LGBT issues, in religious freedom issues, and what emphasis is being placed from many of you on Internet security, Internet freedom?
I'd be glad to correct it there, or any of the others, but you can talk about the Internet freedom component of the program. That's a very big part of our programmatic activity.
I will say, yes, Internet freedom is a very big part of what we do in DRL, and unfortunately, Das Busby, who's the lead on this, was not able to be here this morning. But you've raised a really important point that through our Internet freedom programs, what we're trying to do is make it it's not an access issue. It's when people are on the Internet that they are able to practice the same rights online as they do offline. So we focus our programs on digital safety on the most vulnerable populations and those who are most at risk, human rights activists, journalists. But we have developed special programs for people who are at particular risk. We have done many for the LGBTI persons about how to be very safe online and not to make themselves even more vulnerable than they are. Same with people in religious faith. We've done some very interesting programs working with faith-based organizations, as well as I don't want to get into too much detail, but in places where it's very dangerous for you to be practicing a different religion or to not be practicing a religion, we've kind of created some apps that alert you to when you might be facing imminent danger. It's one of our more exciting things that we've done. So we do it across the board. That's what we try to do. We make sure that those populations most at risk are getting access to our digital training, but also developing apps that might be specific to them. Also a lot more on cell phone technology. I think, again, across the board, one of the first things we did a couple of years ago was to create the panic button. For cell phones, you could download the app, and if you felt that you were about to have your cell phone confiscated by security, you could push the panic button and it would erase all of your contact information so that you didn't put yourself in danger or any of your contacts. But
I would add, if I'm guessing also about the question here, I would add also one robust part of this. That's not just here, it's across the government in several other departments as well, are ways to get around efforts of repressive governments to block Internet communications, and that's another big piece of what we're doing as well here.
So yeah, a lot of anti-censorship so that people in countries where we know they are doing circumvention technology, doing censorship technology, how to get around that, and also about a software that would enable you to be anonymous or encrypt your messages to make you safer.
No, I don't have much to add to that, except that it's a principal concern as well, both in terms of censorship and the desire of some governments to limit access, but also the use of Internet-based platforms to entrap people.
Yeah. And again, we've talked a lot about documentation. We are supporting a lot of you to do documentation of human rights abuses, whether it be security sector abuses or abuses to persons with disabilities or from the LGBTI community. If you're documenting that, you're storing your data someplace, and again, that's going to make you extra vulnerable. So we are very attuned to that, to make sure any program that we're supporting that would be doing anything online, gathering data, that it's also being stored and managed in a way that makes it safer and does not put you at greater risk.
Pat, that's a segue to my question, and I commend the panel, but I especially commend Ambassador Saperstein and Mr. Blaha. because I think you both mentioned, as well as the prior panel, about how important documentation is. We work in northeast Nigeria, where there's extreme failures on all accounts of society to provide equity for those that Boko Haram has attacked. And we are putting together some analysis and some data. But my basic question is there some training that we need to go through? We've got thousands of data points. We've got hundreds of thousands of stories as well. But then, and we've got a team working it right now trying to put data together. But my question is, do you have a basic 101 on how to do that documentation that meets the State Department's requirements?
Well, what I would say on security force abuses, there's no set form about what the Leahy law calls credible information. In fact, those of us in this office have really advocated keeping the form as flexible as possible in order to give us the widest possible latitude to consider what is and is not credible. So to answer your question, no, there is no specific course that I'm aware of, at least. I think maybe the closest things would be the types of courses that perhaps already exist for journalists. And you just answer the basic questions: who, what, when, where, how. The information that's most interesting to us is unit information. And that's sometimes hard to get, because when you're getting killed or tortured or raped, you're not exactly looking at the person's insignia. But there are people in those communities who know what the units are, and that's something that's helpful and instructive to us, because often governments are not that forthcoming in terms of unit information and location.
Generally, in terms of the human rights reports, the religious freedom reports, the TIP reports, the reports, your child soldier reports, et cetera, there are some things that are consistently of assistance to us. Knowing what the source of information is, particularly if it's a source that would be willing to verify with us directly, is absolutely invaluable to the form we get it in doesn't matter as much. But what is the source? The basic information, as you just described. But then what is the source? Here, and describe the source as best as possible. And would that source be willing to talk directly with us, with our intelligence people, with our embassy, depending on the nature of military people, depending on what the nature of the issues are that you are dealing with? Having been just 2.5 months ago in that area of northeast Nigeria, I understand the enormous challenges that you face. That kind of work in that setting that you're doing can really be invaluable. We'll take it in whatever form you can get it, but in general to people, constantly for us, knowing what the source of information you have is, and knowing whether those people will be willing to talk with us. We don't want to jeopardize your sources. We don't want to put anyone in awkward respect if the answer is no here. But often you won't ask, and then you provide us information, and we are limited in using it because we almost always need to verify things ourselves as best as possible. So please keep that in mind in terms of general. And if you want to talk more afterwards, we can do that.
I just wanted to add that there's another aspect in which the documentation of human rights abuses can be important, and one way it comes up in the labor field, we do work in countries in Central America where there is a great deal of violence and threats of violence against trade unionists as well as other human rights defenders. And some of the programs, we are currently funding a program in Honduras that is specifically focused on training and increasing the capacity of local unions because too often they don't have sufficient information to go. There's a climate of impunity, and to be able to make a case, to be able to document to the authorities what exactly happened, when it happened, to how to put together something to turn over to a prosecutor, to turn over to the police is very important in that regard.
We've got just a few minutes left, and I want to have the last two people ask questions, but I just want to add to something that I had noted earlier. Again, we have at every embassy in the world a human rights officer. They will take your information in whatever form it is. As I said, unfortunately, our embassies are fortresses these days. It's hard to get in. But our human rights officers are dedicated. They'll come to you. They'll make it also discreet if you feel too uncomfortable. So they'll happily meet you someplace else. They will take that information. And also you should know that it is our human rights officers out in the field who draft the human rights report. If you read the human rights report and it'll say, well, we have credible reports of this or that abuse, it's coming from you all. So that information is valuable. So I'm going to leave time for the last two questions, please.
Hello, and how are you? Hi, my name is Daniela Bonilla, and I work for an organization called Apretaste, where we're trying to provide free, open access to the internet to Cubans who are on the island using existing technology and infrastructure. So my main question is, as the United States has begun to normalize its relations with Cuba, and as we anticipate future investment and industry growth, what is the standpoint of the DRL, and what sort of strategies are being taken to ensure the implementation of policies by companies that are going to invest in Cuba, that they ensure that there will be corporate responsibility, human rights, things like that?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have our DAS here who could talk about that. I know, though, however, there have been extensive negotiations going on in the telecommunications field to I think, get at what you're talking about. And may I call on Cobb if you can add anything to that in his former position?
You know, I don't know. I can't say whether we've been advocating with. I think this is your question: whether we've been advocating with United States companies who are going to invest in Cuba. I don't know that we've been doing that. We may not. What I do know is one of the things that we are really pushing for is for Cuban people themselves to get more empowered vis-a-vis these companies. So a really good example is, and you guys all read this in the Washington Post, Starwood is setting up hotels, right, in Cuba. And I remember reading the Washington Post article which said, oh yeah, for the first time, Juan Sanchez is going to work for an American firm. That is completely incorrect. Buried down in paragraph, 9 or 10, was the fact that this person works for a Cuban firm, which basically steals 90% of his salary and gives him or her a pittance. So we are urging the Cuban government to lift restrictions like that. That's one of our principal points. In fact, I think President Obama even mentioned it in his speech. Number two, one of the things that we're trying very hard to do is to work with the emerging Cuban private sector, the cuentapropistas. Now, again, the Cuban government has put up numerous roadblocks in that, with that. But what we'd like to do, and what we are advocating and working with both the Cuban government and on-island Cubans on, is figuring out ways that there can be more direct interaction between private U.S. businesses and private Cuban entrepreneurs.
Thank you. Thank you. And our last question, unfortunately, that's all the time we have.
Yeah, I represent NGO in Belgium which targets child domestic labor in 5 African countries. And I would like to know from Mrs. Fox.
Okay. Yeah, a little closer to the mic, maybe.
Now, I represent an NGO based in Belgium which works on child domestic labor in 5 African countries: Rwanda, Burundi, DRC, Uganda, and Kenya. And I would like to know whether this is an area in which you are interested and whether you have any programs in that area. As you know, many of these children are completely exploited, and some are treated like slaves. So I would be interested in knowing whether you're interested in these areas.
We have had a focus on domestic workers generally, particularly though through a migration lens. As I talked about our work focusing particularly in the Gulf area. I would say on child labor that because the Department of Labor's Bureau of International Labor Affairs has historically had significant funding from Congress specifically to address child labor, that we have tended to do less of a focus on child labor in our office at DRL. Not because we don't think these are incredibly important issues, but just in terms of maximizing where we can make the most difference. And that's why I said we focused more on freedom of association.
But does the Department of Labor has a program like you have for global grant?
Yes, they do. They also have ILAB, International Labor
Affairs Bureau.
Thank you, Affairs Bureau. Within the Department of Labor, they also get appropriation from Congress to do programs exactly in this area. And we work obviously very closely with them and coordinate with them.
The Trafficking in Persons Office here at the State Department would also be dealing directly with this issue too, particularly if they're bringing children across borders in that situation. So if that's part of the situation you're looking at, then the Trafficking in Persons Office, which is part of the State Department, would be the appropriate place to be in touch with them. They would be very interested in the information that you have.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. And again, I hope that some of you might be able to stay to take some questions in the lobby out here. If not, thank you again very much to our panel.